Excellencies, Royal Highnesses, I must, ambassadors, friends, colleagues from Diplomatic Academy, I'd like to thank Ambassador Szczepa for the kind welcome. I'd like to thank the Diplomatic Academy for its hospitality. I'd like to mention the Institute for Human Sciences, the Institute for die wissenschaftliche Menschen, of which I am a part. We have a program called Ukraine and European Dialogue, of which I would like to consider this lecture a part. It has been our mission for several years now to try to make Ukraine more of a subject in larger European conversations, and especially here in Austria, to make sense of the connections between the smaller Europe that is Austria and the much larger Europe that Austria has influenced and helped to create. And that, in a way, is the subject of my lecture here. Let me begin with a moment. The moment is the 18th of August, 1948. In the center of Kiev, then the capital of Soviet Ukraine, on the central street, Vladimírska, a Ukrainian officer is dying on a cold slab in prison after about a year in Soviet captivity. At this moment in history, in 1948, in Soviet Ukraine, a Ukrainian officer dying in captivity was hardly something exceptional. It was a very common thing to be happening. At this time, 1948, in Soviet Ukraine, there was a civil war going on. There was resistance to Soviet rule, especially in Western Ukraine. The Soviet forces, along with Ukrainian nationalists and others, had carried out massive ethnic cleansing on the scale of hundreds of thousands of people. Soviet power had forcibly resettled about 1 million people from Western Ukraine. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians had been sent to Siberia in previous months. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians had been killed. So one more Ukrainian officer, one more person sympathetic to the cause of Ukrainian independence, dying in Kiev, one more person, more or less. This was typical. But there were some interesting things about this Ukrainian officer. He had spent the war in this city. He'd spent the war in Vienna. Some of the reasons why this particular Ukrainian officer was threatened to the Soviets had to do not only with their own civil war, but with the larger Cold War that was beginning. As you will all know, Vienna in the 1940s after the war was occupied by four powers at the same time. This particular Ukrainian officer had spent the entire Second World War in Vienna, as well as 1946, 1947, beginning of 1948. No later than 1942, this particular Ukrainian officer was collaborating with a very special part of British intelligence, SOE, the Special Operations Executive. He was helping to put Ukrainians, Ukrainian refugees, often Ukrainian nationalists, in touch with British military intelligence. Their task was to follow German troop movements. Later, it was to follow Soviet troop movements. So this was a very interesting Ukrainian officer, but there was another thing which was interesting about him. The other thing which was interesting about this Ukrainian officer, this man who died, as so many others did at the time, for Ukraine, who one could say chose to die for Ukraine, he had a brother. His older brother, at this very same moment, in 1948, was also having difficulties with communist authorities. His older brother, however, was in Poland. His older brother was not a Ukrainian officer. His older brother was a Polish officer. His older brother had spent the war not in Vienna, but in German-occupied Poland, much of it in German imprisonment. When the Nazis captured his older brother, they offered him a choice. They said, "You seem to come from a German family. Why not accept that you are Volksdeutsch? Why not accept that your family is German? We will then set you free." His older brother refused. His older brother said, "I am Polish. Nationality is a matter of moral choice. It's not a matter of blood. I am Polish." And therefore he remained in German confinement. When the war came to an end, the brother of the Ukrainian officer, this Polish officer, was still in Poland. He was trying, as communism established itself in Poland, he was trying to maintain control of the family property. The main part of the family property was a brewery in Żywiec. And as he settled in Żywiec and tried to press his claim for the family brewery, which he was going to lose, his children returned to school. He had a daughter. This daughter, the Ukrainian officer's niece, the Polish officer's daughter, was beginning school in communist Poland. And as those of you who went to school in communist or Soviet regimes know, part of going to school is that you have to give information about your social class. Are you working class? Are you intelligentsia? Are you perhaps of the peasantry? So this young girl, her name was Maria Krystyna, this young girl, when she was confronted with this questionnaire, are you working class? Are you intelligentsia? Are you peasant? She wrote none of the above. Instead, she filled in her own category. She wrote Habsburg. And this was true. Maria Krystyna was a Habsburg, as was her father, Karl Albrecht, as was her uncle, the man who died in Soviet confinement, Wilhelm. Her father and her uncle were princes of the blood, veterans of the Habsburg army, sons of a Habsburg admiral, Stefan, grandsons of a Habsburg field marshal, great-grandsons of the victor over Napoleon at Aspern, great-great-grandsons of Emperor Leopold, great-great-great-grandsons of Maria Theresia. How did they become what they became? Men who were willing to die for nations. How do they become what they became? Men who were willing to sacrifice for choices. How exactly did these members of, let's say, the greatest family in the history of Europe, how did these members of this great family become members of nations which would be oppressed and in many ways forgotten? How are these choices possible and why did they make them? I'd like to share with you an explanation. And the explanation is going to seem exotic. And some of the details might seem interesting. But the case I'd like to make is that Wilhelm von Habsburg, as Papageno says to the prince when he meets him in the forest, is ein Mensch wie du. That actually the life that he leads is not so very different from some of the mainstreams of European history. The case I'm going to try to make is that his life, strange though it might seem, actually reveals some of the major currents that we ought to all understand, and indeed some of the major currents that bring Ukraine and Austria closer together. So let me begin with the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs in the 19th century are the family from which Wilhelm comes. Wilhelm is born towards the end of the 19th century in 1895. The Habsburgs in the 19th century did not know what we know, which is that their power would come to an end in 1918. It would be very strange for them even to have such a thought. If you were a Habsburg, then of course you took for granted that your family would rule forever. And by forever, I mean forever. The sense of time that Habsburgs had was very different from the sense of time that we have, or I should say most of us have, since there are some Habsburgs here in the audience. The Habsburg sense of time assumed that, quite literally, Austria erat in orbe ultima. Austria est imperare orbe universum. Austria can rule everything, and Austria can rule everything for all time. Now, this was a family which had been in power for some 600 years. This was a family which, in its time, had indeed had power in every continent in the world. This was a family which had ruled the world's greatest empire. So, the interesting thing about the Habsburgs in the 19th century was that they were trying to make a conversion which is very familiar to Europe in the 20th century. The conversion, the change that they were trying to make was from being a maritime empire, right? A European power that has wealth and exerts power because of its connections around the world, to becoming a European power that exists because it's of ability to bring together multiple societies, let's call them nations, inside Europe. That is, I would submit, the great question of the European 20th century and maybe the 21st century. Can European power make the transition from exploiting far corners of the world to some form of cooperation among European societies inside Europe itself? The Habsburg monarchy of the 19th century was a first example of this transition. With the exception of a bit of territory along the Adriatic Sea, Istria, Dalmatia, the Habsburgs were no longer a maritime empire. They were becoming a land empire. The great question for the Habsburgs, especially after 1848, was, can they bring together in some kind of effective unity, not harmony, but some kind of effective unity, the various nations under their control? What Europeans learned from the revolutions of 1848 was that all nations, although they might wish to be liberated from kings and emperors, also wish to oppress other nations. With the exception of, let's say, Iceland, this is pretty much an iron rule of European politics, that the very nations that wish to liberate themselves from an empire or a kingdom also wish to oppress other nations. The wish of the Poles to liberate themselves from the Habsburgs is the same as their wish to oppress the Ukrainians. The wish of the Hungarians to liberate themselves from the Habsburg is the same as their wish to oppress the Slovaks and the Romanians, and so on and so forth. So what we learned from the revolutions of 1848 is that just removing an emperor or king does not resolve national problems. It just poses them in entirely different ways. So 1848 is a turning point in European history. After 1848, there are two new things which hadn't existed before. The first, and it's very important and entirely forgotten, is royal nationalism. This is Italy, this is Germany. The idea that a new kind of king will assemble a new nation on the basis of nationalist wars, using arguments which today we might categorize as populist. That a king will reach beyond the middle classes. You better be tweeting. Are you tweeting? You're just looking stuff up. Okay. Just asking. Okay, thanks. So the, you weren't tweeting, were you? Okay. No, I mean, I just think if we're going to come out and be together, let's just not have the, thank you, phones out. So the trick then is, how do you take nationalism if you're a king, right? The Prussian kings, the Italian kings learned that they can maneuver nationalism by way of wars to create new states. The Habsburgs find themselves in a very different position, which is that as Germany unifies and as Italy unifies, they lose territory. They control less territory. Moreover, if this principle of nations being unified by kings continue, then the Habsburgs will cease to exist. If every nation is unified by new kings, then all the Habsburg territories will go away. So the second possible solution is what the Habsburgs tried, which is a series of national compromises, right? Nothing is more boring, as all of you students of the European Union here at the Diplomatische Akademie know, nothing is more boring than compromises among nations, and nothing is probably more important. So the way the Habsburg monarchy works is that after 1848, especially after the Constitution of 1867, a series of compromises are made with Hungarians, with Poles, with Czechs. Compromises are planned with Slovenians and Ukrainians in order to hold the entire thing together. Now, what about the future? This is where Wilhelm's family's history begins, with this question. What about the future? If you're in Europe, looking at Europe from the Habsburg point of view, looking outward from Vienna, two national unifications have already happened, Italian and German. Two national unifications seem like they're almost certain to happen in the future, Yugoslav and Polish. And both of those are threatening the same way that German and Italian unification were threatening. If they happen, they will take away territory. If there's a Yugoslav unification, it will take away Habsburg territory in Croatia and Habsburg territory in Bosnia. If there's a Polish unification, it will take away Habsburg territory in Galicia. Unless this entire logic can be turned around and the national unifications take place not against Habsburgs, but with Habsburgs. not against Habsburgs, but under Habsburgs. This is where we see the political imagination of Wilhelm's father, Stefan. What Stefan decided to do was to raise a family in the spirit of national unifications yet to come. His idea was that his sons and daughters would become the rulers of these Polish or these Yugoslav nations that had yet to be united. And in this way, the Habsburg monarchy could be extended rather than reduced by national unifications in the future. Now, Stefan was a very imaginative man. He liked to sail. He sailed to Latin America. He lived on the island of Loshing, which if you haven't yet made plans for your semester ferien, is a very nice place to go. He gathered 200 species of plant from around the world and planted them around his estate in Loshing. If you go there now, you'll see that the work is given, the credit for this botanical spectaculaire is given to a Croatian scientist, but it was actually Stefan who did it. He spent most of his time painting, although he could not paint at all, and was perfectly aware that he could not paint at all. He had an entire room in his castle built to hold an adult-size toy train set that you could ride around on. It was powered by real steam. He was a man of imagination, was Stefan, but he was not wrong about Poland and Yugoslavia. There was a Polish unification. He was right. There was a Yugoslav unification. He predicted those things, he predicted them correctly. And he bet his family on those things. So there were 6 children. Stefan and his wife Maya Teresi had 6 children. Eleonora, Karl Albrecht, Renata, Mathildis, Leo, and then Wilhelm. Take the name of Leo. Okay? Leo von Habsburg, Leo Habsburg. That doesn't sound extraordinary. But names at the time, names in the era of the eternal politics of the Habsburgs were deeply symbolic. So Leo's name was in fact Leo Karl Cyril Methodius Habsburg, which, let's face it, that's a cool name, right, for one thing. But there's a deep logic to it. Leo was born on the feast day of Cyril and Methodius. The feast day of Cyril and Methodius had just been made an official feast day by the Catholic Church. The Pope who made that decision was Leo, right? So Leo, born on the feast day of Cyril and Methodius, was named after Leo the Pope, who made the feast day of Cyril and Methodius also a Catholic, observed Catholic holiday. But legendarily, the father of Cyril and Methodius was also named Leo. And legendarily, the father of Cyril and Methodius was named Maria. His full name was Leo Karl Maria Cyril Methodius Habsburg. So in this name, you have the logic of Western and Eastern Christianity coming together, which makes perfect sense because Stefan's idea with Leo was that Leo might one day become the king of some future Yugoslavia. I will not be giving away the story if I say Leo does not become king of Yugoslavia. But there is a Yugoslavia, right? There is a Yugoslavia does come about in a different way. That was not wrong. Wilhelm, the youngest son, born in 1895. You'll of course think of the obvious reference. The obvious reference in Wilhelm's name was to Wilhelm II, at the time King Emperor of Germany. And as we'll see in 1918, our Wilhelm von Habsburg, is going to meet that Wilhelm II of Germany, at a very critical moment. But the name Wilhelm, for those students of Polish history out there, I'm looking for students of Polish history, I see half of one. Wilhelm was also the last Habsburg to press a serious and plausible claim on the Polish throne at the end of the 14th century. That Wilhelm von Habsburg went to Poland in 1385 only to be seen off by Polish nobles who had a better idea, which was to marry the Polish king, who at the time was a 12 or 13-year-old Hungarian girl, to marry her off to Yes, the Polish king was a 12 or 13, and that is by not the strangest fact of Polish history. To marry the Polish king, who was a 12 or 13-year-old Hungarian girl, to the Grand Duke of Lithuania, right? So that was a major turning point in Polish and Habsburg history, which every Habsburg would have known, because it's at that point that the Habsburgs lose Poland. Poland turns eastward. In fact, that's the turning point for Polish history as well, where Poland becomes an East European country, as opposed to a Central European country. So Wilhelm is named Wilhelm because he is meant to be the next Habsburg who makes a claim to Poland. That is his father's idea. Now, I want to stress a point here, which is that this is not so strange. All nationalisms that work look ahead. After a nationalism succeeds, it can afford to look behind. After a nationalism succeeds, it can afford to teach its children all kinds of nonsense about the past. See European history curricula, 21st century. But before a nationalism succeeds, it has to be about the future. A nationalism that is not about the future cannot possibly succeed. You cannot do something like think up, create, seize a state without thinking about the future. So Stefan thinking about the future in this way was actually typical of the late 19th century. Not only kings and aristocrats were thinking in this way, so were nationalists or people aspiring to statehood in general. Now, as those of you who are parents of children know, the plans that you make for your children aren't always 100% of the time exactly what the children turn out to do. And that is Wilhelm's story. So Wilhelm was meant to be Polish. And a time came in his family's history when it looked like he would become Polish. This was in 1907. His father, Stefan, inherited from his own adoptive father an enormous estate in Galicia, in western Galicia, in and around the city of Jänner. So the entire family, which had been living on this island paradise of Włochy, the children walking around every day speaking Italian, English, French, German, and Polish, these living, drinking wine at 10 o'clock in the morning and at noon, because even as children, they drank wine. They left this paradise to go to, and I mean nothing against the city of Jänner, which is a wonderful place, but they left this paradise in the Adriatic to come to Poland, where it is cold, okay? And at the time, Wilhelm was 13, which is a sensitive age. So Wilhelm, who had known nothing but this island paradise, is brought to Galicia at the age of 13. But it's in Galicia, in Austrian Galicia, the Austrian partition of Poland, where Stefan means to make his claim to become the leader of the Polish royal family, the Habsburg leader of a future Polish royal family. It's 1907, these dreams are not very far off. 9 years later, people will be talking seriously about a Habsburg king of Poland, right? Stefan is not so far off in his predictions. But his son Wilhelm is 13. And then we see something very interesting, which we often see in the history of nations, which is that family dynamics turn out to be incredibly important. So what happens in Poland is that Wilhelm's older sisters, Renata, Mechtildis, they marry members of Polish aristocratic families. Renata marries Radziwill, which is a name which I assume still means something to some of us out there. So the Radziwills are probably the most famous Polish family at the time. Set number 2 is probably Czartoryski, so Mechtildis marries Czartoryski. Now, Eleonora, by the way, married Alphonse Klos, who was a sailor. She married for love. Whole interesting story. But 2 sisters marry these Polish aristocratic families. Now, think about this from the point of view of 13-year-old or 14-year-old, 15-year-old Wilhelm. First of all, brothers-in-law are inherently annoying. Secondly, I was just waiting to see who would laugh in what order. Because when you give a lecture in front of a lot of people, it's all just one big social experiment, really. And I remembered you laughed first. Secondly, older brothers-in-law are always annoying, right? Because they're not your father, and still they come and they tell you what to do all the time. Third, Polish brothers-in-law are annoying. Fourth, Polish aristocratic brothers-in-law are annoying. And fifth, Polish aristocratic brothers-in-law who are more likely to become king of Poland than you are extremely annoying. And that was Wilhelm's problem. His whole life he'd been raised to think that he was likely to be king of Poland. But now that his sisters were being married off to Polish aristocrats, those Polish aristocrats and their children suddenly became more likely king of Poland than he did. What do you do in this situation? Well, if you're a teenager, you rebel. And how do you rebel? The way teenagers always rebel. By doing something which is like your father, but completely different from your father. If you're being raised to be king of Poland, the ideal way to rebel is to say, well, yes, I'd like to be king, but I'd like to be king of Ukraine. Right? There's no clearer way to rebel against Polish aristocrats than to say, I'm a Ukrainian. Those families that Radziwiłł and Czartoryski were families that had owned hundreds of thousands, as people said in Russia in the 19th century, of Ukrainian souls, of Ukrainian serfs. These were families that thought of Ukraine as essentially their private colony. The idea that Ukraine was a nation and that you as a Habsburg royal prince were going to be king of that nation was just about the harshest thing you could do to those brothers-in-law. And it was also a way of rebelling against your father while at the same time not losing your father's ambition, which is a rather beautiful thing to carry on. There's a story, of course, here, which is that Wilhelm runs away from home. He gets as far as Jänner. He supposedly gets as far as a beautiful little place, which is now in the middle of a national park in the Hutzul country. It's called Horota. There's a story that he meets the Hutsuls, who are Ukrainian ethnic group in the West, in the Carpathians, and he falls in love with them. It's unclear how much this is true, but he does become Ukrainian. He does start to identify with Ukrainians. And this happens at the same time that he's entering the military academy. And he's entering the military academy here in Wiener Neustadt. He's entering the military academy right at the time of the Balkan Wars. Why is that important? Because in the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, suddenly the Habsburgs have to think, what if there's another Balkan War? What if this Balkan War expands? What if we have to fight Serbia? Which of course they will in 1914, right? This trial of history, which Stefan has predicted, is coming very close now. What will happen if we have to fight Serbia? If we have to fight Serbia, we'll also have to fight Russia. If we have to fight Russia, where will we fight in Russia? In Ukraine. Where will the Eastern Front be? It will be in Ukraine. It will be in our Galicia, or it will be in their Ukraine, but it will be among Ukrainian-speaking people. Oh, how many Ukrainian-speaking officers do we have? Almost none. And hence, when this young Habsburg, who thinks he's rebelling against his father and his destiny, enters the military academy, the emperor himself, Franz Josef, says, it's a very good idea you have to become Ukrainian. Why not become a Ukrainian-speaking officer? And that's what he does. In June of 1915, now a year into the First World War, in June of 1915, when Wilhelm is commissioned as an officer, as a second lieutenant, he's given a platoon of largely Ukrainian-speaking soldiers, and he fights with them on the Eastern Front. The summer of 1915, as you military historians will remember, is the time when the Habsburg army is actually pushing the Russian army back eastward. It's a time of an offensive. Galicia is retaken. The Habsburg army is pushing eastward. And this is a time that Wilhelm himself very much enjoys. Now, then Wilhelm adds a political dimension to all of this. So remember, we're now talking about a young man who is 20 years old. He's 20 years old in 1915 when he gets his commission. At the age of 21, 22, his tuberculosis flares up. And because like all important historical figures of the fin de siècle, he has tuberculosis. I had forgotten to mention that, but I assume you just take it for granted. They all have tuberculosis, right? I'm going to stop there. I was going to say other things about the diseases that they all had, but that would take us too far afield because Wilhelm did not actually have those diseases. He only had tuberculosis. Though because of his tuberculosis, thank you for smiling. Because of his tuberculosis, he was sent back to Vienna. And interestingly, in Vienna, he begins to think about politics, because there is a Ukrainian question. If we, the Habsburgs, are going to push into Ukraine, what are we going to do? What are we going to tell our Ukrainians? What are we going to give them? Perhaps we can do something for them, which they, in Austrian domestic politics, have been asking for a long time. Let's split Galicia in half, have a Polish western half and Ukrainian eastern half. Conveniently for Wilhelm, he can talk about this with his father, who at the time seems likely to become King of Poland, right? Conveniently for Wilhelm, after the death of Franz Joseph, he can talk about this to Emperor Karl, who is only, I think, 7 or 9 years older than he is, and who he has known since he was a boy, and who seems to like him. So Wilhelm and Karl talk about the Ukrainian question. Then, in late 1917, when Wilhelm is in Vienna, there is the Bolshevik Revolution, which opens the Ukrainian question in an entirely different way. And Wilhelm begins to argue for what eventually happens, which is a peace that recognizes a Ukrainian state. The Habsburgs and the Germans in early 1918 recognize a Ukrainian national republic in what's known as the bread peace. It's remembered in Germany and also in Austria as the bread peace, because the idea was that Ukrainian foodstuffs would be sent to fund the war that the Germans and the Austrians were fighting. On the 18th of February 1918, Archduke Wilhelm was sent with a battle group named after himself, Battle Group Archduke Wilhelm, deep, deep, deep into Ukraine. So no, we're no longer talking about Galicia. We're now talking about the Dnieper River. We're now talking about a place which is very close to the lines of battle between Russian and Ukrainian troops in Ukraine right now. Where Wilhelm was sent was to the Sich, the ancient, not legendary, but ancient Ukrainian fortress, which is an island in the middle of the Dnieper River, deep into southeastern Ukraine. And there, in the spring of 1918, Wilhelm, as a young man of 22, 23, experienced an extraordinary political high. He was very good at talking to Ukrainians. He spoke Ukrainian, which people liked very much. He had the gift of being simple, so that peasants or Cossacks could see him as one of their own. Perhaps most impressively, because he regarded himself as a prince of the highest family in Europe, and of course of creation and so on, when he met local or Polish or Russian aristocrats, who of course owned the land and thought they owned the people of Ukraine, he would do things like slap them on the face, which the Ukrainians really liked. They hadn't met anyone who would slap Polish and Russian princes in the face before. And suddenly here was this 23-year-old slim man who thought that he could slap them like he could slap anybody else, because he was a Habsburg. So he was very popular. He was so popular that the Germans were worried. So here I have to explain something, which is that in 1918, in the first half of 1918, most of what is now Ukraine was under German and Austrian occupation. The Germans had Kiev in the north, the Habsburgs had much of the south. And this was a competitive occupation. It was competitive in a couple of ways. One way was locally. The Germans took the bread peace very literally and just needed to extract as much bread as they could because they wanted to win the war in France. The Ukrainians also extracted food, and the Habsburgs also extracted food and also created a lot of resistance. But they did have a certain amount of political sense that the Germans maybe lacked. I'll give you an example. If you read the telegrams of the German diplomats back to Berlin, they say things like, the Habsburgs just gave beautiful uniforms to all of their Ukrainian officers. Why do we never think of things like that? Wilhelm was an example of this policy. Wilhelm carried out, in the part of Ukraine that he controlled, a policy that he called, in German and in Ukrainian, Ukrainization. Ukrainization. Wilhelm in 1918 in Ukraine talked about Ukrainization. We'll push the Poles out, push the Ukrainians out. We're going to use the Ukrainian language. We'll treat that as the language of state. The larger difference in visions I've already suggested. As you'll remember, Karl von Habsburg, the Emperor Karl, was pressing for a peace. He was pressing for a truce. He was pressing for a ceasefire. And there was a logic here. The logic was, if we can get a ceasefire, let's say in the spring of 1918, Austrian and German forces will still control a lot of Eastern Europe, and then we can argue amongst ourselves about what's going to happen to it. The Germans, of course, were not interested in that. The Germans were interested in victory. So, because the Germans were afraid of Wilhelm, the Germans thought that, if you read again the German telegraphy about Wilhelm, they say things like, he is the most popular politician in Ukraine, everybody wants to elect him king, he personally is a threat to our control over Ukraine. Things like this, which were more or less true. Wilhelm wanted to come to Kiev. The Germans really didn't want him to come to Kiev because they thought as soon as he came to Kiev, there would be a coup d'etat and Wilhelm would be elected king. Instead, the Germans persuaded Karl to send our Wilhelm von Habsburg, to talk to the other Wilhelm II. The date on which this conversation took place was the 8th of August 1918, which is a critical point in the history of the war. On the 8th of August 1918, we have the Battle of Amiens in France, which the Germans lose decisively. It's the beginning of the end. It's the battle that demonstrates that the Germans not only are not winning, but cannot win. The Battle of Amiens demonstrates the futility of continuing the war in the West at a time when the Americans are arriving, which, by the way, is what Leo and Wilhelm had been trying to say for some months to their German allies. The Germans in this late summer campaign would lose 1 million men, even as 1 million Americans landed in Europe. This war could not be won. So on this date, all of these visions come to an end. The German vision of an empire in Europe, the Habsburg vision of an expanded multinational empire in Europe, all of these things are put to an end in the name of the nation state. Which brings us to the post-war. So, we take the nation state for granted. We think that the nation is normal. Austria, normal. Czech Republic, normal. Slovakia, normal. Poland, normal. We think these things are normal. This is an idea which comes to us from 1918. After 1918, French Republicans, I mean Republicans in the sense not of American Republicans, Republicans in the sense of people who support a republic, French Republicans, Austrian Republicans, American Republicans, people took for granted that a republic was the same thing as progress. A republic had to be inside a nation state. This was the course of history and indeed of nature. But the thing about the nation state, as we learned in the 1920s and 1930s, is that the nation state will tend to conflict with other nation states unless there's some higher level of politics. Indeed, this was the lesson of Europe of 1848, that nations, when they break free of empires, will begin to oppress other nations. And if there is no higher level of politics, this will continue. And to make a very long and interesting story short, this is what happens in Europe in the 1920s and 1930s. One sees it even in the family conflict within the Habsburgs. So long as the Habsburg monarchy continued, Wilhelm and his father Stefan could talk. Wilhelm was a Ukrainian rebel. His father Stefan was going to be the king of Poland. Indeed, he almost became the king of Poland. But they could talk. They could talk about how they would divide up people, how they divide up wealth, how they divide up land. The moment there are nation states, this becomes impossible. Once there's a Polish nation state, the fact that Wilhelm is a Ukrainian means that the Polish state wants to take his father's property. And so naturally the father has to say, I have nothing to do with the son, I never had anything to do with the son, and the son has to say, I never had anything to do with the father, even though until very recently they got along very beautifully. Wilhelm gets involved in a few plans to intervene in the Soviet Union. These don't work out, so he then does what an aristocrat of his particular set of relations would do, which is that he moves to Spain. Wilhelm has so many interesting relations, as the Habsburgs did, that I can't possibly mention them all without making this very complicated, so I will just mention the one that mattered. His first cousin was the King of Spain. His first cousin was King Alfonso XIII of Spain. His aunt, indeed, had been a regent of Spain. Alfonso was born king, so he was literally brought on a silver platter to the Spanish prime minister, which is what happens if you're born king. I mean, I realize it's too late for all of us to be born king if you're here, but if it ever happens to you in some future or past life that you're born Spanish king, you will be brought on a silver platter to the Spanish prime minister, right, after your baptism. So his cousin Alfonso was king of Spain, and the two of them had lots of fun together. They both liked motor cars. Alfonso liked to found football clubs. If there are any Real Madrid fans out there, the reason Real Madrid is called Real Madrid is that Alfonso is the person who founded Real Madrid. Alfonso also sponsored, and this is not the official biographies, 6 pornographic movies. Wilhelm and Alfonso had a lot of fun together, it seems. Wilhelm then and someone that he also saw in Spain was Empress Zita. So, and he would continue to see Zita afterwards. Wilhelm then moves to Paris, again, as an aristocrat does. And he spends most of the 1920s and the first half of the 1930s in Paris. What does he do in Paris? In Paris, there's the gap, or the contrast between his aristocratic life and his Ukrainian life grows. But interestingly, both lives continue at the same time. On the one hand, he goes to the beach, he is seen with famous French dancers, he golfs, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, and this is interesting, fellow Ukrainian veterans continue to regard him as a Ukrainian, and as an honorable Ukrainian, and as a Ukrainian officer, and address him as a Ukrainian officer. He continues to speak Ukrainian, and interestingly, in his Paris exile, his Ukrainian only gets better, which is not something that happens unless you work at it. His written Ukrainian gets much, much better in his time in Paris, which again is not something that happens unless you work at it. So the man was certainly not a decadent wastrel. And in moments of political crisis, for example, during the Holodomor, during the Great Famine in Soviet Ukraine, the political famine in Soviet Ukraine of 1932 and 1933, Wilhelm tries to intervene on behalf of Soviet Ukrainians, who at the time are dying by the millions. He tries to draw the attention of Western figures to the fate of Ukrainians inside Soviet Ukraine. At the same time, his life in Paris is one of scandal. Now, in the 1930s in Paris, the threshold for scandal is very high, right? I mean, if you want to read the documents of people who are jaundiced and cynical about life, read the part of the Paris police archive that is responsible for following exiled aristocrats in the 1930s. These are men who have seen it all and are impressed by little. So, Habsburg has left his house wearing a dress one more time. Ho hum is the general tonality of the whole thing. So they record, but without special interest, Wilhelm's comings and goings with attractive members of both sexes. There were many men, I don't have time to talk about it, there were many men in Wilhelm's life. And he had a very interesting attitude about masculinity. I would sum it up by saying he seems to have been far more confident and secure in his masculinity than many of the political leaders of our own time. I'll just put it that way. He also had Slavic political leaders included, but not only. I can think of some American ones. But there were important women in his life. And again, you see this enormous stretch and contrast between the aristocratic and the popular. On the one hand, the most important woman in his life was probably Zita. The most important person in his life was the person who was the central to the possibility of a Habsburg restoration. Zita, the mother of Otto, Zita, the person who was central to the Habsburg family at the time. And he saw an awful lot of Zita. And of course, around Zita, he was goodness and innocence itself. But in the mid-1930s, the other important woman in his life was a woman of bottomless scandal and immorality called Paulette Koiva, whose scandals were so extraordinary that, again, if I even began to raise the subject, because her scandals were the kind of thing that made headlines in France, which again is a very high threshold. For some reason, as the Austrian diplomats cautiously wrote in January of 1935 from Paris back to Vienna, Archduke Wilhelm was incautious enough to have become involved with a lady of a questionable past. They meant Paulette Gruber. And in some complicated way, it's not entirely clear just how this worked, but in some complicated way, Wilhelm and Paulette together were raising money, some of which may have been going to, I'm sorry to say, the cause of a Habsburg restoration. It's not clear whether Paulette was defrauding Wilhelm, although I think that's probably what was happening. I think she was using him more than he was using her. But when the scandals were tried in French court, naturally you can imagine they were tried in a very nationalist way. Of course, Paulette, who was from a working class family and worked at the post office, of course she must be being exploited by this Habsburg Archduke. That's the way the French press played it. That's the way the French judge played it. I don't think that's actually the truth. I think she was much more sophisticated and ruthless. And Wilhelm, although in some ways he was intelligent, was extremely naive about some kinds of human relations. I think at the end of the day, she was exploiting him. But be that as it may, it was he who was found guilty, and it was he who fled France to go back to Austria and to escape the 5-year prison sentence that he was given. This, of course, was a problem and a blow to the Habsburg family as a whole. Until the scandal, Zita and Wilhelm saw each other regularly, and it seems fairly clear that Zita and Otto, who was then growing up, are thinking about Ukraine as part of some kind of future Habsburg restoration. When there is this very public scandal, which has many embarrassing details, some of which were exaggerated, if that's possible, even Wilhelm understood this was a problem. The way he summed it up, he wrote about Zita in this way. He said, "The poor thing knew nothing of any of this, and now she suffers," which I think is fair. I think it's fair to say that Zita, as well as the Habsburg cause, suffered. Otto saw to it that Wilhelm was deprived of the Order of the Golden Fleece. Okay, so he leaves Paris and he comes to Austria. And in Austria, again, Wilhelm is, although the details are striking, his political path is not so different from the mainstream really of Europe. In Austria, he turns to the right. In Austria, he decides that the Fatherland Front is probably the right way to govern a country. In Austria, he decides that Germany is the only hope for Europe because Germany is the only country that can destroy Poland and the Soviet Union. In Austria, he starts to dream up plans of right-wing Ukrainian international conspiracies that will somehow restore Ukraine. He wants Germany to destroy Poland. But then, in September of 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union do destroy Poland. And then his older brother is sent to a camp, and then his older brother suffers, and then he thinks. He wants Germany to destroy the Soviet Union. And then in 1941, Germany invades the Soviet Union, and like many Ukrainian nationalists, Wilhelm is disappointed by the fact that no Ukrainian state is created, and on the contrary, Ukrainians are exploited perhaps even more than they were under Soviet rule. So, and the Nazis, of course, show no interest in Wilhelm at all. Insofar as the Nazis pay attention to Wilhelm, it is to mock him in their propaganda for the scandal in Paris. So probably in 1941, no later than 1942, Wilhelm goes to work for the Special Operations Executive of Great Britain. He goes to work for British military intelligence, recruiting Ukrainians to work for Britain, first against the Germans and then against the Soviets. He also begins to cooperate with the French Christian Democrats, the Mouvement de NKVD, probably also with French military intelligence. He accepts the Austrian Republic after the war when it comes. He joins the ÖVP. So again, the mainstream, if you like, of Austrian history, people with very complicated political pasts, just pretending that really this was all about a mass center-right party the entire time, right? This is a major theme in Austrian history. Wilhelm partakes in that. He accepts the Republic, and he gets a job for the first time in his life, right? Which is quite an extraordinary development. He seems to have been working in an office. Now, it is in this capacity in post-war Vienna that the Soviets arrest him. The first time I lived in Vienna, I had a party, and it was late and it was loud, and the neighbors called the police. I didn't realize that like this was an event, that this kind of thing could have world historical implications, but what happened to Wilhelm was that someone had a party, it was too late, and the neighbors called the police. And when the police came, they found that the person whose birthday it was a young Ukrainian. And this young Ukrainian was working for British military intelligence, and he'd been recruited by somebody who in turn had been recruited by Wilhelm. And so the neighbor who called the police on the late party led inadvertently to the arrest of Wilhelm von Habsburg. The Soviets caught him in August 1947 on the platform at the Südbahnhof. They took him back to Lviv and then to Kiev. They interrogated him for almost a year, and that is where he died, as this forgotten Ukrainian. What conclusions do we draw from this? He died forgotten. As the ambassador said, it's fair to say that this is a figure who, if remembered at all, is remembered in very strange and partial ways. We do not imagine that this is how Habsburgs die. We do not imagine that Habsburgs die under Soviet interrogation. This is not the kind of thing which comes easily to mind. We do not imagine that Habsburg history and Ukrainian history could be so tightly connected that one of the most important Ukrainians of the first half of the 20th century could be a Habsburg. More broadly, we tend to imagine in Austria and about Austria that the Cold War, the Iron Curtain, that line just east of here between Austria and Slovakia, somehow made of Austria a West European country. We tend to forget or underestimate the deep organic connections between Austria and the nations to its east and to its north, especially to Ukraine. So this is an extraordinary individual, it seems, a Habsburg who helped make Ukraine, a Habsburg who helped bring Ukrainian consciousness to Ukrainians. But how extraordinary was that, really? After all, after 1867, it was the Habsburgs who allowed a free press, among other things in the Ukrainian language. It was the Habsburgs who allowed Ukrainian political parties. It was under Habsburg rule that Ukrainian history was written for the first time as serious history. So the connection in this individual reveals a much deeper connection. Wilhelm was a Habsburg who chose a nationality. How strange is that? Less strange than it seems. Many Habsburgs since then have chosen many other modern nationalities. His brothers ended up choosing one Polish and one Austrian-German nationality. His sisters ended up Polish. It wasn't that strange. And indeed, if you look at the phenomenon more broadly, elites choosing nations before nations chose them was very common. Because if you think about it, why not choose the nation before it chooses you? Why not decide who you're going to be before somebody else decides who you are? The people with financial, political, and intellectual resources, the elites, very often did that. They could see the nation was coming, and so they decided to choose for themselves which nation they would belong to. And this leads us to a very interesting consideration about the nation itself. The nation tells a couple of kinds of stories about itself. They have to do with the past. One story is fatherlands. The nation exists because of what was written down. The nation exists because of father to son, king to prince. We exist because we've always had kings here. We've always had the law. Another story is motherlands. The nation exists because of language. We've always had songs. We've always had the stories of the people. We've always been a majority. Both of those stories, although they are told against each other, have something in common, which is that they are determinist. They say, this we has always been here. But of course that's not true. The real question about the European nations is, why do we have the European nations that we have, and not some other set of European nations? That's the real question. And to get to the answer, we have to remember that the nation was about the future. And since the nation was about the future, which nations we have, Ukraine for one, Austria for another, very often depended on the choices that were made by individuals. Second conclusion had to do with the state. We might think that Wilhelm's way of seeing the world, or more broadly, the Habsburg way of seeing the world in the late 19th century, early 20th century was curious. How strange to think that even though there would be more nations, they could be contained within some larger entity that would tolerate them and would regulate their relations with law. How strange, we say. Of course it was natural that the Habsburg monarchy had to break apart, didn't it? But it didn't. If it hadn't been for the First World War, it wouldn't have. The idea that the Habsburgs had that their rule might continue deep into another century, or maybe another one after that, was not at all so crazy. If Karl and Wilhelm had been able to halt the First World War in early 1918, there might still be a Habsburg monarchy. Maybe not now, but after 1918, certainly. But more fundamentally, think of the basic nature of their politics. What Wilhelm was saying was, nations are real, nations are the way of the future, but the nation state is not self-sufficient. That's an interesting point, which seems to have proved itself over time. Basically nowhere in the 20th century does the European nation state prove itself to be self-sufficient. It fails over and over again, either ceasing to exist or bringing about war. Which is why, of course, the European Union is an interesting place, because the European Union, whatever its imperfections and flaws, provides a higher level of politics of the kind that the Habsburg Empire used to provide. It regulates relations among national societies by way of law and negotiation, as opposed to by way of oppression and war. This seems to be a very basic point, and it helps us to understand Ukraine today. Ukraine today is a nation which is political. We are all puzzled. How can Ukrainians speak so many languages and still be one nation? Which is a very strange point for Austrians to make. And it's also a very strange point for Americans to make, right? I mean, as a nation that doesn't even have, that has 0 languages of its own. But nevertheless, we look at Ukraine and say, how can they have one nation when they have 2 languages or more? But that's normal. We ask, how can people be choosing their nation? That's not how it works. But historically speaking, that is in fact how it works. And we say, why do these Ukrainians want to join Europe? And here comes the crucial point. It's only from the periphery of Europe that you see what the European Union is actually for. When you're inside the European Union, you take it for granted. But the historical purpose of the European Union is that it takes fragments of European empires, like this one, the one we're standing in. It takes fragments of European empires, and it turns them into plausible states. That's the historical function of the European Union. The only way that Europe was able to preserve a similar level of prosperity, having lost its external empires, was that it was able to create a European Union. That is the trick that Europe played on history. But having played that trick, Europeans inside the European Union forget it. It's only remembered from the periphery, from the countries that want to join. When Ukrainians say, our state has major problems, and therefore we want to join the European Union, they are expressing a correct understanding of European history. All European states had major problems. That's why they joined the European Union. No European state is plausible on its own. That's why they all are in or have really strong relationships with the European Union. So what I'm trying to say is that from the periphery, we sometimes see the essential about the center. In the case of Wilhelm von Habsburg, sometimes it's the exotic which helps us to see what's essential. I'm going to close with the words of Unter von Habsburg from 2004, when he said, "The future of Europe will be decided in Lviv and in Kiev." I think he's probably right. I would only add the city of Dnipro, which happens to be the city in southeastern Ukraine, which is closest to where Wilhelm went in 1918 when he established his own version of Ukrainization. Thank you very much.
position as a moderator first, and then turn it over to the audience. And my question is, first of all, I would like to ask you as a Ukrainian about the myth of Wasyl Wyschywanyi. Basically, the man who is known to you as Wilhelm von Habsburg is what Ukrainians' first name Василь, and the second name is Вишиваний. Вишиванка is the national shirt that Ukrainians wear, and that Wilhelm von Habsburg also preferred. And the most exciting moment, I think, for us Ukrainians in this myth of Wasyl Wyschywanyi is when this young Habsburg, the member of the family who runs the big parts of the world, the world is his oyster, right? He decides, for some reason, to travel to Ukraine, parts of the empire that he heard mostly bad things about, right? Because this is what Polish aristocrats always said about how they often saw Ukraine as some dark place, inhabited by robbers and by bandits. And nevertheless, he chooses exactly this part of empire, and he somehow travels there, and he sees nothing of the kind that he heard of. He sees normal people wearing wonderful clothes, Christian, in many ways European, and he doesn't get disappointed. He falls in love with these people, and I understand that there was a big part of political calculation in this move. He wanted to be the king of Ukraine, but when he fails, and he understands there is no chance that he will ever become a king of Ukraine, and his whole ambition will basically go down the drain. He doesn't get bitter, he doesn't get disappointed, and among all these love affairs that he had in his life with women, men, his love affair with Ukraine was actually the biggest one. So, what's your interpretation? Was it only political? Why did he stuck with Ukraine so much that even in his last days he introduced himself to his future murderers from NKVD as Wasyl Wyschywanyi, not as Wilhelm von Habsburg?
So those interrogation protocols of Wilhelm with his Soviet interrogators are incredibly interesting. And thanks to the open policies of Ukrainian archives, they can actually be read and have been read by me and other people, including, I think, members of the Habsburg family, if I'm not mistaken. And it's extraordinarily interesting to see the confrontation of the Soviet point of view with his point of view. They ask him questions like the one you're asking me. And he starts talking about his boyhood and sailing in the Adriatic, and these things which seem completely irrelevant and are clearly meant to evade the question, but which are somehow relevant. His life did make a kind of sense of that, and I was trying to make sense of it. The reason he became Ukrainian had to do with coming of age at a time of mass politics from a certain very special perspective. And of course, I stressed the family particularities, because without the family particularities, he could not have become Ukrainian. He learned Ukrainian because he was a native speaker of Polish, right? If it hadn't been for that, that was a necessary condition, right? So when he meets those Hutsuls, he can talk to them in Polish, and of course they understand him, and then they talk back to him in Hutsul dialect, and of course he understands that too. But he was raised to speak Polish literally from birth. From birth, he was speaking Polish. He was a native Polish speaker. And without that, of course, he couldn't have become Ukrainian. These were all necessary conditions. Without the rise of Polish and Ukrainian national movements, this whole choice would not have been available. So I'm talking about this from the point of view of the Habsburgs, but the Habsburgs are looking at really existing political forces, including the Polish and Ukrainian national movements, and Stefan is making a choice for the Polish one. And then, as I say, Wilhelm, for reasons that have to do with family dynamics and psychology and being the youngest child, sympathizes with Ukraine. Now, in this sympathy with Ukraine, I think, though, there is more than just the hostility to Poles who he thinks are, I mean, he has some very nasty things to say about Poles, which is a Polish historian at the time I found kind of refreshing and interesting, but he regards the Poles as being decadent and aristocratic, and he has some very poetic things to say about them. You know, that they had their springtime of nations, but their autumn is coming, and so on. I mean, what he's really talking about is the Polish aristocracy, and he's really talking about his brothers-in-law, I think. But when he meets Ukrainians, there's also something positive that happens, as you say, which is that he likes them, and they like him too. And it's actually not clear if in his life he had ever met people like this. Free, because if you're a Habsburg, especially not so much now, but before 1918, your entire life is controlled. I mean, you walk, even with your family, you walk into the dining room in the correct order of rank. You change clothes 3 times a day. When he ran away to the Ukrainians, none of this applied anymore. He could suddenly just be a teenager, basically. And he met people he could run around with, and he could act like a normal person. I think that has something to do with it. And it plays into his politics. When he was young, he was clearly on the left. He was called the Red Prince, not because he wore red, or because red is a Ukrainian color. He was called the Red Prince by Polish officers who saw how he commanded when he was a lieutenant in the Habsburg army. They saw how he was promoting the Ukrainians and fraternizing with the Ukrainians. And they saw that correctly, not just as a national, but as a social move. That he was sympathetic with the downtrodden, which was true. When he was a cadet at Wiener Neustadt, and he would come to Vienna, he would notice the Viennese proletariat, the working class. And he wrote at the time about his sympathy for the working class. He read the Austro-Marxists. As a teenager, he read the I don't know how much he understood. He wasn't a great political theorist, but he read the Austro-Marxists. So his sympathies were with the normal person, right? And insofar as he had a politics, I think the politics was something like, there was a word at the time, Linksmonarchie, right? I mean, his politics were something like, if I'm the king, then democracy is going to be possible. National democracy is going to be possible. But you make an extremely good point, which goes beyond all this, about loyalty. And I think you're right. I think this is the most touching thing about him. Because he could have gone off to Spain and France and forgotten about the Ukrainians. And if his connection to them had been purely calculating, he would have. But interestingly, that's exactly the opposite of what he did. He kept reading in Ukrainian, he kept writing in Ukrainian, he made new Ukrainian friends. He was seen as a Ukrainian authority. And what I found touching reading documents, was how Ukrainians in Paris immigration, like people who were having a tough time, right? I mean, because most Ukrainians in immigration in the 20s and 30s were not necessarily doing that well. People who were having a tough time would still think that he was a good person. They weren't resentful of him. Like, he still had that ability to come up to treat others as being equal, like on the basis of nationality. And then, so you're absolutely right that, I mean, in all these love affairs, which would be a completely different book, and in all of his change in his politics, from left to right, and then I think back to center at the end, in all of his politics, he was loyal to the Ukrainians. And in every state, he thought he was doing, when he was left, he thought he was helping the Ukrainians. When he was right, he thought he was helping the Ukrainians. When he was center, he thought he was helping the Ukrainians. And in the end, he died for Ukraine. He died for Ukraine. He didn't have to. He knew he was taking risks. He knew he was taking risks, and he died for Ukraine. And in the interrogation protocols, it's like he gives away almost nothing, which is also pretty extraordinary. He's loyal to his Ukrainian friends down to the end. So I think that you made a point which is very much worth making, which is the one, once he makes the choice, I mean, we talk about, he could have made other choices. We know he could have made other choices because people close to him made other choices. But once he made the choice as a teenager, he stayed with that for the rest of his life. Yeah.
It's amazing. I know it would be rather bold of me to share my historical theories with you, but I have a theory about all the bad things that happened in 20th century, the Nazism, the fascism, to some extent communism, that it came through this feeling of pride, hubris, arrogance, that we gave the world the best music, we built the most beautiful cities in the world. We are the ones who are born to rule the world. And by the way, it's not only the German-speaking part of Europe. If you read, I don't know, Blavatsky or Tsiolkovsky, you also feel this, pride, гордыня in Ukrainian. And when I look at Wilhelm, I see complete opposite of it. I mean, I see this humility. And I ask myself, was it just an aberration, or was it a path not walked for Europe back 100 years ago? And by the way, also for Ukraine. I'm thinking if Ukrainian nationalism would have been Wasyl Wyschywanyi nationalism, and not as bitter and angry as it turned out to be in reality, it would make a big difference also for Ukraine. So, what do you think of it?
So I think part of what you're describing in Wilhelm was actually his Habsburg background. Because the Habsburgs had to govern a country of multiple languages and peoples. And it was normal for them to go to those peoples and speak their language. So Franz Josef, appearing in some tiny village, wherever, Bukovina, Galicia, he would do his best to speak the local language, and that was expected of him. Wilhelm and his brothers and sisters who had either 5 native languages or 0, depending on how you think about it, who spoke Italian, French, English, German, Polish equally well, they were normal. That was a normal way to raise a Habsburg at the time, because the notion was we are not representing the heights of any one nation, right? The Habsburg monarchy was not defined on the national principle. The notion was we rule because of the family we are, which of course has its own problems, but they're different problems. So there was a humility in the way that the Habsburgs ran their affairs, which you can contrast. I mean, it's impossible not to contrast it with the Germans. When you see the two sides of them at war in the First World War, on the one hand, okay, the Germans are the ones who are winning the battles. Let's not forget that part of it. On the other hand, the Habsburgs are the ones who are thinking, we may not have a total victory here. We might want to start some negotiations with people ahead of time. Maybe that wouldn't be such a bad idea. So part of what's happening, I think, is that it's that Habsburg way of doing things, where you don't get to rule because you're the most important person in the most important nation. You're actually not allowed to say that any nation is the most important nation because you have to rule them all. I think Wilhelm had that, and I think that's a little bit of what got lost in European politics when the Habsburgs went away. And it's not just the Germans. We'll compare the Habsburgs to the Americans. So when Woodrow Wilson gives his famous speech with the 14 points to the United Houses of the American Congress, how many African Americans were there? It's an easy one, right? 0. How many women? There's also an easy one. But whereas in the Habsburg Parliament, which admittedly was suspended during the war to make the comparison fair, but in the Habsburg Parliament there were representatives of every nationality, more or less proportionately, right? And so the idea that Americans are going to come and say, this is what national rights mean, which is what we did, right? We told the Habsburgs, national rights mean that you have to self-destruct, right? That's also, I think, pride, right? So some of what you're talking about is the Habsburgs. Some of it, though, is Wilhelm himself. I mean, some of it is that he did have this winning way with people, where it's amazing reading the documents of the other Ukrainians serious Ukrainians, people who had been officers in the Russian Imperial Army, who had gone to the Ukrainian side, and then they come down to the siege and they meet Wilhelm, and they say, wow, this person really knows how to get along with our people, right? He would get off his horse and talk to people. I mean, this is just simple things. He would get off his horse. He would drink beer, right? He would drink whatever anyone else was drinking. He would look people in the eye and he would talk to them. And he called everybody tea. I mean, he had a winning way about him, which is immediately popular among the Cossacks and among Ukrainians generally. There was something special about his personality, and it is true that, I mean, his claims he always made on behalf of other people, and that way he was modest. He had many flaws, but pride was not one of them. He never talked about how wonderful he was. He did talk about how wonderful the Ukrainian nation was, but he never talked about how wonderful he himself was.
Quite frankly, when I was reading your book, I almost became a monarchist. Because
You just made some people here very happy.
Oh, really?
The foreign ministry position will be awaited tomorrow.
I'm looking at Ukrainian politicians and I'm asking myself how many of those have made such an effort, I mean, to be accepted and to be respected by their people as this Habsburg did 100 years ago. Your professor, thank you so much. May I turn